Welcome to DigitalK.
So I was really glad to hear in the questions this idea of surveillance capitalism was brought up, because it's going to be a theme that's going to be throughout my presentation. But before I do, I just want to understand who here owns crypto. Can you put up your hands? And who here's used that crypto for anything beyond just holding it? Okay, that's pretty impressive. I won't ask what for, probably dark market. So as was just suggested in the introduction, I'm going to hopefully stretch your understanding of the application of tokenization. I wouldn't use the term cryptocurrencies because currency implies a particular utility. But the idea that tokenization can be useful for more than just what you might think of as people using it in the context of a currency. And equally, I'm going to use all the buzzwords that Andreas said that I shouldn't use in the context of blockchain, which is thinking about distributed ledger technology in combination with things like IoT and AI, and at the heart of that, the power of tokens to kind of fuel those networks. So I love putting this image on a big screen to really bring home the idea of surveillance capitalism. So first, if we have some kind of context, if we think about the last 20 years of the internet, what we've seen is two kind of trends emerge that are related. So the first one is the platform, which effectively is kind of mediated marketplaces, mediated trust, Facebook, Google, what have you. And then the cloud, which effectively is the IT infrastructure that's allowed those platforms to achieve planetary scale. And of course, that's delivered as great convenience as users. That's really hard to deny. And the success has meant that it's made a few platforms very wealthy, and of course a few lucky VCs that followed. And that success has meant that they increasingly claim dominion over human experience, and that's increasingly not just in a digital context, it's in a real world context. So if we think about the innovations in AR and VR, and the biometrics that they get from these devices tracking how your retina responds to these digital hallucinations, they are literally going to know you better than you know yourself. They are literally inside you. So you can't get more intrusive than inside. And at the heart of the platform model is something that's increasingly been referred to as surveillance capitalism. There's a great book, it's about that thick, that if you haven't read it, you really should. And it gives us a language to understand the enemy and really unpacks the economics behind Googlenomics, which is the predominant economic model of the platform. Effectively, this kind of surveillance capitalism is predicated on the idea of behavioral modification through proprietary algorithm. Now, there's certain variations of this. So in China, you could say it's digital statism. A lot of these platforms are just an extension of the state. And increasingly, as we're seeing this trade war play out, it's becoming very apparent that a lot of the platforms from the US are also extensions of the US government. And so when actually we think about the consequence of that, increasingly this discomfort, at least here in Europe, that the trade-offs of the convenience of these kind of cloud platform model are increasingly eroding the sovereignty of states. If you think about Uber, riding roughshod over local laws, protecting industries in Europe. If you think about data privacy and data protection, the right to be forgotten. There is this kind of appetite to top-down, try to deconstruct platforms, to break up monopolies, to try to contain their overreach. But in my perspective, I think it's safe to say that this has gone beyond threatening the sovereignty of states to threatening our personal sovereignty. But that's not necessarily what I'm going to talk about. And by the way, I do think that's a huge opportunity here in Europe for there to be a third way about how we might approach the internet. One that is not antisocial, that is respects industries and local laws and citizens' rights, but that is also market-oriented. What I want to talk about, though, is what is kind of a bottom-up challenge to the cloud platform model. Some people call it the decentralized web, some people call it Web 3. But at the heart, it prizes the idea of decentralization and self-sovereignty and self-sovereign ownership of data over all else. And what we're seeing is a series of internet protocols that are emerging that bring the opportunity to unbundle platforms. And so at Outlier Ventures, my firm, which is just under 5 years old, specifically investing in the blockchain space, we kind of defined these emerging technologies as something we called convergence. I think it was about 2014. And that laid out this framework to say, as we look at these new emergent internet protocols, that increasingly they speak to everything from the hardware layer, how we collect data, how we transport that data, how we make it available in data marketplaces, and then how we can do increasing levels of automation through smart contracts, and then in combination with machine learning allow for greater levels of autonomy. And so this emergent technology stack that we've been both tracking, investing, and incubating in promises to unbundle the cloud, unbundle the platforms and decentralize the cloud, and better distribute value to the network as opposed to a handful of platform monopolies. And so at the heart of distributed ledger technology in a decentralized web, for me, is the promise of a new data economy. Now, coming to the point of the presentation, most people, when they think of this kind of disintermediation, this unbundling of platforms and intermediaries, is that it's going to enable new forms of peer-to-peer value transfer between people. And of course, this is true. You can say Bitcoin is the first form of peer-to-peer money native to the internet. But actually, if you think about the internet as it is already today, there are more devices connected to the internet than people. Half of all web traffic is from bots, and half of that is what you would call malicious bots, malicious activity, because there is simply no cost to that activity, the malicious activity happening at scale. And so when you're thinking about these new emergent internet protocols and what you're designing for, the population that you're designing for, actually people are just one part of it and an increasingly shrinking part of it. So it's also peer-to-peer in the context of machine-to-machine, and increasingly in the context of a decentralized web where we can trust that the web respects our self-sovereignty rather than the platform. We can increasingly outsource economic work to digital representatives that serve us as an individual or as a collective as opposed to a platform. And so increasingly we can have high degrees of autonomy through digital representatives, and we move away from what most people think of as these annoying bots that pretend to be human in a customer service context. Now, the really interesting thing about these other constituents of the population, whether that's devices or digital representatives, in effect, they're machines, and machines are really good at responding to logic. They're very good at being rational, unlike people, as any economist will tell you. And so the promise here is that we can leverage for and design for protocols that can allow for incentives and disincentives for the machine economy and digital representatives. And that promises the potential of a rules-based web, not just one top-down set of rules, but a marketplace of rules. And so one of the most exciting things about tokenized and DLT networks is the innovation of governance itself and the socioeconomic principles that can be applied in their design. And we can move away from that value concentrating in a handful of platforms to a wider network that can have increasing levels of autonomy. So kind of picking up on Andreas' talk about what you might want to optimize for, if we think about Bitcoin, it optimizes for a very particular game that's played out by miners to secure the network with all the qualities that he mentioned previously, at the expense of energy consumption and various other things. That it made those trade-offs. But actually, if we take these same mechanisms, these same principles, the same toolkit, we can design for games that optimize for different problems. And if you think about token design and game theory, the point is to try to optimize for something that could be expressed in a mathematical formula so it can be measured and optimized. So actually, I believe in very specialized tokenized systems that could optimize for any one of these things. And this is already happening. There are already ledgers looking to optimize for bandwidth, compute, storage in a decentralized way. And so if we think about all the inefficiencies in our world, this new toolkit promises to allow us to potentially even meet our sustainability goals. So it's what you want to optimize for, what problem you want to solve for, and the idea that tokens can effectively be the incentive to bootstrap these networks, for participants to bootstrap these networks, and then as a coordination mechanism to enforce a cost to malicious or bad behavior and an incentive for the right kind of behavior from the right kind of participants. And so the way to think about ledgers and tokenized ledgers is the idea that now we have this new toolkit that will allow for global, often permissionless public utilities. And these utilities can serve social good as well as commercial ends. And so over the last 3 years, we've evolved the previous image that I showed you, which was kind of an investment thesis and a concept about how DLT may converge and combine with AI and IoT, into something we now understand as a literal technology stack. And so we've placed some of our investments that we've incubated in there, but also protocols that we think are foundational, and we put it in something similar to an OSI framework in order that it could be understood by any developer. One of the big problems that we have in the crypto space is we have this tendency to create our own language, our own vernacular, that precludes most developers. So we talk about layer 1 and layer 2, and it means absolutely nothing to most developers. But actually, if you put it in this context, you can understand it's everything from hardware, distribution, routing, verification, up to the application layer, which might have a learning component. And so this is a literal technology stack. It's open. There are different combinations that can be used or applied. But the way that we now look at ourselves as an investor is rather than having a portfolio of things that are loosely related, we begin to look at our portfolio as a stack of technologies that are highly correlated, highly synergistic, and are more likely to have impact and be adopted when used in combination. And so we've oriented our whole business, our 30-plus full-time staff, and we'll be deploying about 30 million of capital, not into the projects themselves, but to support them. So alongside the capital that we invest, we will also invest a further $30 million over the next 3 years in supporting these tokenized networks in the diffusion of their innovation. And so we've built this platform to help both in terms of the design of the game that we want these tokenized networks to play, how we can then optimize them and refine them because they should be living, breathing things. They should be adaptive, so they're not fragile, and they should evolve based upon how the market uses them, as elegantly put by the previous speaker. And so actually, when we think about who are the users for this stack, we don't think of them as businesses. Actually, they're developers, because we're investing primarily at the protocol layer. We're not investing necessarily in businesses that build on top. Often these are open source foundations. They may have a commercial component, but they're often open source foundations that kind of govern this technology set and might participate in the economic governance of that network. But increasingly, we're looking at how these technologies can be diffused, and that's helping developers both understand them and then adopt them. And so that's why I'm here in Sofia, but more generally traveling around both the Baltics and Eastern Europe, where there are clearly very well-developed developer communities. Because if you're a startup that's thinking about creating a new business and a new business model, or you're an enterprise that's thinking of creating a new product or service line, the reality is most people are still thinking in the old paradigm of highly centralized cloud platforms. And actually, your business model is probably going to be already redundant. So the question is, how can you design for a business model that's going to be relevant for this current paradigm? And hopefully not within this antisocial, extractive, and ultimately unsustainable cloud platform model.